good afternoon, everyone. Very excited to be here with you this afternoon, and hope to live up to the wonderful introduction that I've been given. Basically, purpose of my part of the presentation today, I'm going to just kind of review what life skills are and make sure we're all on the same page as to what they might be. And then I'm going to focus on how individual differences within the individual people that we coach might influence how well they're able to learn from the way in which we coach life skills. So to define life skills to begin with, I've got a couple of different definitions here for you. The first is that they are skills that enable individuals to succeed in different environments in which they live, such as school, home, and in their neighborhoods. But then bringing it a little bit close to sport, the second one by Gordon Carson, those internal personal assets, characteristics, and skills, such as goal setting, emotional control, self-esteem, and hard work ethic, that can be facilitated or developed in sport and transferred for use in non-sport settings. And it's those last two parts of that definition that I think are really important for us. So sport offers us a vehicle or an environment in which we can develop some important skills. If we take emotional control, the referee makes a bad call, you can get really angry about it, or you can regulate your emotions and carry on and continue to perform. Now, as coaches, we can help develop that within the sports setting. If it stays within the sports setting, so it's a sports skill. If we then transfer, or we coach them and help them transfer that for use in non-sport settings, then it becomes a life skill. So, you're walking home from school and somebody calls you a name or what have you, and you choose to, or you control your emotions in that instance, then it has become a life skill, but facilitated and developed in sport. Now, I have a feeling that most of you are here because you're interested in life skills and you think they're important. And that I may be repeating a little bit of what was in the last webinar, so I apologize, but this is just my pitch for why I think they're important. And primarily, I'm using some data here from the NCAA, which you can go and read for yourselves. The links are at the bottom, which basically talks you through how many high school participants make it to the NCAA or college level, which is the next step in the talent development pathway in the US. And as you can see, overall, we're talking about a relatively small percentage, somewhere between 3 and 10% roughly. And then the next stage of that, how many of those from college go on to participate in professional sport, is a small percentage of that number. So in terms of the number of athletes that are going on to actually perform in professional leagues, is a percentage of a percentage. So if a very small number are going on to perform at that level, then maybe a core part of our coaching should be on developing life skills to help them help them function in those other environments in life. So home, school, and neighborhoods, as that initial definition was put up. And that's kind of my pitch for then. We need to be developing athletes holistically, and that being really important. Probably also links to athlete well-being as well. So that's what life skills are, and kind of my pitch for why I think they're important. I want to spend most of my time really talking about individual differences. And, the reason I've got these two pictures up on the screen is I think when we, as coaches, we can see physical differences in our participants in terms of height. We can see that some can do certain skills and others can't. And we adapt our coaching to those individuals. And I think sometimes when it comes to life skills or positive youth development, we tend to give a bit of a blanket approach of, well, we're going to learn this skill in this particular way, and everyone will learn in exactly the same way. And what I'm hoping to do is kind of show that that's not necessarily true. And we might need to think about some of the psychosocial differences within our individuals, the people that we coach, that will make a difference to how well they learn from some of the life skill interventions we might make as coaches. And I'm going to do that by talking through a couple of examples from an intensive wrestling camp project that I was involved with a few years ago while I was at Michigan State. Now, I've only got 15 minutes, so I'm not going to be able to talk you through the entire camp, but I'm going to give you kind of the highlights here. So this square in the middle, this model in the middle, is the wrestling camp and how it was designed to try and develop the individuals that were there. It was a 2-week wrestling camp, I should say. It was for high school aged athletes, and it was intensive. There was an awful lot of wrestling and other fitness lifting, running kind of stuff that was involved. And I think what's key for us here in terms of reflecting on how it developed individuals is that it had a strategic program design, including mental attitude talks, as they were termed at the camp, that helped participants to develop skills to cope with the intensity of the camp. And importantly, as part of that, there was kind of I'm going to call it a life skills component, but they talked about how that skill might be used outside of wrestling or outside of the camp and transfer as well. And what we found by interviewing and observing 8 athletes before, during, after the camp, and also 6 months later after their wrestling season, is these 5 broad categories of psychological skill development for sport and for life. So enhanced confidence, increased work ethic, so things like hard work, discipline, concentration, personal empowerment, so being able to take responsibility and accountability for actions, as an example. Enhanced thought process, so understanding of self, motivational orientations, and interpersonal skills, so leadership and altruism. Now, if we look at all 8 participants together, we get this block of 5. But if you look at the individuals within that, their outcomes are all, on a sliding scale as to how many of these they picked up and whether they transferred them into non-sport settings. They were a life skill. And we determined that there were 3 things that impacted how well that kind of transfer happened for them. And we call them individual psychological antecedents, but essentially it's individual differences in terms of their readiness, openness, and reflectiveness. Readiness being the psychological and physical skills that they already possessed, their psychosocial development, and preparedness to engage with the camp. Their openness, so how open their mindset was to learning, did they want to learn new skills? And their reflectiveness, their ability to reflect on themselves and the events of the camp in order to learn from them. So if we take a look at a couple of examples here, we've got Wrestler 1, and he was really fortunate that he'd had a couple of peers go to the camp the year before and come back and have very different outcomes. One was very successful and one less so. And on reflecting on the more successful peer, he said, this is a quote from the participant. He said he was like, the most important thing here, when you get home, you can't be like, okay, I went to the intensive wrestling camp, I'm already the best. You got to go home, continue to train and run, get up and lift weights and all of that. And for me, I think there's a couple things there. One, he was ready for the camp in terms of he knew what was going to happen at the camp. But 2, he was a little bit older, so probably a little bit more psychosocial development, but also in terms of some of the skills that he'd developed by working with this peer, probably a bit more ready for the camp. And he was much more open to it. He described the camp as starting the achievement process schedule, which I'm aware is quite vague, but he knew that there was going to be some mental skills taught and he wanted to learn them. And that was part of his thinking. And he was also incredibly reflective. He talks here about walking around campus to reflect. And what that means is, come the end of the next wrestling season, he was able to provide examples of each 5 of these psychological skills, both in terms of wrestling, but also outside of wrestling, life skill transfer. So if I need, so in terms of personal empowerment and accountability and responsibility, he said, if I needed like shoes or knee pads, I didn't wait for my parents to drive me all the way up to the store. I just walked up there and got my bike and got them myself. So starting to take a little bit more ownership. And I know that probably sits a little bit on the boundary between sport and non-sport, but I'm choosing to represent that as kind of a non-sport application in this instance. Wrestler 2, on the other hand, a little bit younger, a little bit less psychosocially mature, and also didn't have a peer that had gone the year before. He'd found the camp by doing some research on the internet and found out it was pretty much the one you wanted to go to improve your wrestling skills. It was very focused on the physical wrestling skills. So I think he was a little bit less ready. He didn't necessarily, or he was less aware of what the camp was about. Maybe a little bit less ready in terms of his, some of the psychological skills he might already have. When I asked him if he wanted to gain any mental skills from camp, he said, no, not really. I already have a good mental attitude, which is not necessarily suggesting that he's closed off to learning, but he wasn't as open. It was going to take a little bit more encouragement to get him there. And unfortunately, when people aren't very reflective, it's sometimes difficult to pick out a good quote, but I can tell you from the observations and conversations I entered into with him that he was much less reflective than Wrestler 1. So come the end of the wrestling season, we've maybe picked up, we've picked up 4 of these categories. And even though he talked about, oh yeah, I transferred that into like school, when you asked for examples, he found it quite difficult to give them. So they'd stayed much more around his wrestling and sports skill. So I just worked a lot harder in practice, did everything I could, listened to the coaches, wrestled with the coaches a lot more so they could help teach me things. Much better at providing those examples, which is, I think, partly he was less open to learning the mental skills going in, but a lot of it probably resting on that reflectiveness and being able to listen to and learn from the talks that were given at camp and then apply them in his home context. So what does that mean for us then in terms of the results of this study? Now, I just want to say that I don't think the individual psychological antecedents that we've got on here are necessarily the full breadth of everything that's out there that we need to take into account. They're just some reflections that I'm having on this particular study. So in terms of readiness, I think partially it's understanding where our participants are currently at, what they're able to do, and therefore what our next step might be. We wouldn't, again, I've got this picture of some kids playing sport. We wouldn't ask them to do physical skills they're not capable of doing yet. We might build up to them through other things. In terms of our openness, we need to understand the wants and needs of our participants or generate the want and need. So we might need to ask them and talk to them. If we think that a particular life skill is important, then we might need to help them understand why they need this life skill and generate some of that want and need. And I believe Martin will speak more to that in the next part. And then in terms of reflectiveness, I don't think any of us can claim to be the perfect reflective practitioner. So continuing to develop our own reflective practice, but also helping our participants to develop their reflective practice as well, which might just be, and I'm sure you'll hear more about this in the second presentation, but engaging in conversations around the life skills that you're trying to teach and how they might be used in other contexts. So I have some general things to think about for us as coaches then. One is to read and understand psychosocial development, based on age and stage and those kinds of things for coaches. And I know the I Coach Kids MOOCs and materials have got lots of those in there. But it might help us think about what we want to include as life skills. As we hit adolescence, teenagers are more ready to take on leadership roles and understand leadership because they can empathize more with other people. But they're also at a period of time where peers matter much more to them. And so that becomes a bit of a challenge for them. So how we want to do that and how we might layer in leadership might change then, depending on the participant. And understanding the natural transitions that are going on. So like between primary and secondary school or whatever the school differences are in your country. So that you can integrate skills that the participants want and need relevant to what's going on. We also need to observe and make sure what we see and hear from our participants matches up, or where it doesn't match up with what the literature says. We all know books tell us one thing, but our eyes might tell us something else. But I think what is really key for me, particularly as we hit adolescence and people being agents of their own change, is involve them and ask them, what are your wants? What are your needs? Speak to parents as well, get them in on the process. Particularly as that's going to help then as you try and integrate things alongside your practice to develop life skills in participants. So quick summary slide, because I know I'm running pretty close to time. Laid it out as a bit of a process. I think the first thing is, as I laid out at the beginning, committing to, as coaches, as organizations, as administrators, to having life skills and positive youth development more broadly as core to what it is that we do. The next stage is understanding our participants and their wants and needs and the differences between them, including asking them and involving them in the process, which then will impact on which life skills we choose to include, but also how we go about doing it and the level of challenge we present. And you're going to hear from Martin about implicit versus explicit pedagogies. And whilst I don't have data on this yet, the implication that depending on readiness, openness, and reflectiveness, implicit or explicit pedagogies might be more or less effective for those participants as well. And if we get all that right, we augment our practice, we don't replace our physical practices, we end up with this celebratory life skills for home, school, sport, and neighborhoods as well.